in. It's this massively differentiated, constantly full of membranes and places where things are different from where they were a millimeter away. So there's lots of ways to draw boundaries. It's just then you tend to sort of reify them and take them too seriously, which I guess the process thinking is intended to at least kind of mitigate to some degree.
Yeah, just to add to that, am I unmuted? Yeah, just to add to that, with the boundaries that we have to draw, there is an interesting, within the literature on quasi-species or mutant swarms and all that, there is always the scientists themselves are very aware that there's a quasi-species concept of physics. There's a quasi-species concept of biology, of the epidemiologist. Each one has a slightly different take and will draw other things into that dynamic system they are considering. So it's really this, we need to draw some boundaries, but it depends on our practices and our epistemic interests, what we want out of our investigation. And with the holobiont thing, what I was struck, again, going back to the quasi-species thing, is that this kind of division of labor that happens within the swarm, where certain viruses can be, certain forms of the same virus can be dragged along by the group because they can complement for some things that this particular defective particle or entity could not do. And it's kind of they feed off each other, they pool resources or recombine, like if in influenza with its 8 different segments and kind of mix and match. But it's, yeah, so that is kind of it's a much more elaborate, not a living view of viruses, but it's division of labor is an interesting facet of that, and what the resources they draw in, that struck me as very interesting as well.
If possible, I would have a question.
Yeah, please.
Thanks. Thank you for being here and well, for being there. But Stefan, initially you said that your approach to the issue is quite technical, and therefore you described that as kind of different from the lecture we had before, for example, like the pig influenza and so on. And now we are speaking about the boundaries. How do we define boundaries? So I'm not that sure what you meant by technical, so maybe you can give some more details. But what I see here is that the boundaries cannot just decide it on a technical level. If I consider technical in terms of biology, what is biology, but is more a biopolitics decision that also infiltrate into science then and into biology. So this is my take on that, but I would be very happy to know more about what you think about that.
Yeah, no, I think you're perfectly right. I mean, what I meant with technical is more kind of the literature and the questions I'm reading and trying to respond to, and these are because we're kind of defending a process ontology which is within philosophy of science still very controversial for many, and there have been some kind of replies. No, it's all about intrinsic dispositions, dispositional essentialism. It's like analytic philosophy, and it's not something I can do, but it's something I want to address using philosophical technical language and kind of, well, how do we define the essence of the virus understood as a dispositional essentialism and blah, 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 which is, I just think that philosophical literature is so far away from actual politics and life and biopolitics, but it does pick up something that comes up, which is what has been noted before, kind of, the functional unity and where do you draw these lines. As abstract as the philosophers are, they do, they got a point, and I wanna get to that. So that's what I meant. But I fully agree. It's one big it's such a big melting pot. It's how you wade through that is super difficult, and you need to keep your mind so open. So yeah, I meant philosophical, technical, if that
Okay,
explains it.
Picking up on one key phrase from this process ontology, functional unity, Nicholas Risher, I guess is the, am I saying that name right?
Yeah.
Risher?
So.
It's a new literature for me, but I was just trying to hold that together with maybe, could we talk about dysfunctional unity? Like in part, the paper looks at moments where there's a rupture, where, you know, the host cell produces the virus and then it's killed. And, you know, from the host, like thinking not from the virus's perspective now, but from the multicellular host, it, you know, some of these viruses are good, and I think you do really interesting work to show that. And maybe some of the viruses are just kind of neutral, or, you know, might have like kind of nonsense from so you could also maybe take apart functional unity with kind of an absurdist ontology, like, you know, this isn't really going anywhere, it's just, you know, here's you know, information that's just kind of floating around, it's not really doing anything good or anything bad. But I think like a case like COVID-19 makes painfully clear, like there's also dysfunctional unities, or maybe unity isn't quite the right word for how the assemblage hangs together. So I think this process ontology literature is doing some really important and interesting things, but how do we account for these antagonisms that emerge? I think another key phrase of the article is you're talking about a collaborative interaction between processes. And you know, that word collaboration is a really interesting one. You know, sometimes, you know, like in a context of military occupation, like collaboration, like the collaborator in Nazi-occupied France is, you know, like that's the sellout, like that's the one. So sometimes collaborations are forced, sometimes collaborations can end eternal standoffs between enemies and allies. But yeah, I wonder, like, is it possible to account for antagonism in collaboration, to account for, yeah, again, maybe the nonsense absurdist things that we see when we look too close at viral genomes?
There's a paper that actually I wrote with Maureen O'Malley, who some of you may have come across her work, quite a while ago, about 2009, where we actually advocate using the word collaboration precisely in this way, to stop talking about in kind of, in a sense, essentialist ways about whether, you know, there's a standard classification of mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism. So you're basically either you're good, bad, or you're neutral. And one of the things that we wanted to emphasize in really kind of, at least for philosophers, opening up a lot of discussion of symbiosis, was the idea that you have anywhere. Not only do you have a whole spectrum of cases, from extremely you know, nasty things to absolutely essential things for you to survive at all, but that the status of these various constituents of a process can change along the spectrum all the time. So, I mean, I think viruses, one thing that happens with viruses is they probably start out nastier than they end up in systems. I mean, that eventually evolution will probably, you know, leave most viruses that we interact with as relatively stable, mostly not too terrible parts of our ecology. I don't know, that's just a speculation, but certainly, you know, the status of these things is variable, and, you know, there are lots of things in your stomach that you don't want to get into the wrong parts of your body. They will do great damage. So it's very contextual, all of these terms, and we actually suggested the word collaboration as a neutral term for things that, without any kind of judgment as to whether they were good or bad. And So I'm glad you like the word, because I'm trying to promote that as a way of making that point.
But doesn't collaboration assume some kind of agency or an agreement or consent or an action when in places where they may not be?
I mean, it's not a perfect word for sure. I guess I just think, that maybe think of working in the same place rather than actually together in that. But yeah, sure, there are connotations that can be misleading. Absolutely, yes, you're right.
Hi.
Stefan? Or Fan, go ahead.
Go.
Hi, thank you so much. I really enjoy the papers, and I work in media studies, and I don't know if you guys are familiar with this book called Life After New Media, Mediation as a Vital Process. And there's lots of parallels to be drawn in the rethinking of media, not as objects, but as, quote, in the examination of the interlocking technical, social, and biological processes of mediation. And so I'm kind of formulating a question, but I'm not sure if I have it yet, is to what extent does this kind of processual understanding of virus also allow us to think about the interconnections between the event or events generated by the coronavirus and our immediate turn to media as we conventionally know it, as some sort of solution or response. So it's not really a formulated question, but I'm trying to draw some connections between the media studies field and the type of work that you do, which is really fascinating.
Good.
I mean, well, I can go ahead, but I'm not sure. What one thing in the media that is fascinating to me is the solidification that happens to make what is going on travel through whatever circuits media represents and brings together, and kind of because all you see when you type in COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2, blah, blah, is again the viral particle. So to make the virus travel within media, you can't let it travel as the complex cycle that it is. So the whole abstraction idealization process, like one process restricts the richness of another process, even though we have two here. We have like the existing viral process and how we represent it. So I'm mixing things, but I'm just like, that would be one connection that comes up for me, but I'm not sure whether that answers or is within the point that you're trying to raise, but that's one thing that fascinates me.
That's actually a really interesting connection that I was thinking about too. Earlier, we were talking about the dominant media representation of the virus. It's sort of a stabilization, if problematic, of what is so impossible to capture. And it seems like that's a fetishized object that stands in for a complex process that cannot be represented. So it is about the limits of representation, but also the turn to that representation in order to grapple with a process that is impossible to capture. So thank you, yeah.
I mean, if I just add to that, I mean, I think that the sometimes process ontology is just so obvious it doesn't, it kind of can elude one, because I mean, nobody tries to provide that kind of stable thing-like representation of the human side of this interaction. And I mean, it's pretty obvious that the human responses to this are processual through and through. I mean, we're changing, we have these immensely complex and immensely culturally diverse ways in which we interact with one another, and we're all changing them dramatically in intentional response to this interaction. And I guess it's quite odd to think that the other side of this two-sided kind of intertwining of activity is just a bunch of kind of, you know, these little stick ball kind of balls covered in sticks just lying around. You put up little fences around them and avoid them. But the reality, of course, is that the kind of system, the interaction of the two systems is these intertwined process, and the media are part of the articulation of our response to this interaction. So it's in a sense, it's just, you know, in a process world, it's obvious that there's a very significant role to something, you know, one of the processes that we use to mediate our collective behavior and interactions.
I think one interesting thing is also, so we are in a pandemic, and whilst we're in the pandemic, we're thinking about the next pandemic and kind of how could we avoid emergence of future outbreaks and blah, blah, blah. And there seem to be different approaches in a sense. Whilst we're in the current pandemic, we have this dominant picture of the particle attacking us all in red or flashy colors and all that. When we think about the future outbreaks, at least in the media that I've read, it's interesting to see that there's much more talk about biopolitics, deforestation. There, it's like, because the implication is we're breeding viruses, and that is a much more kind of interconnected processual view of viruses. We're kind of, well, not all people do that. Some just treat it as there are dangerous viruses out there, and we go too deep into the forest and we bring them up. But it's kind of, in a lot of articles that I've in newspapers, not academic articles, but sometimes written by academics, is this kind of the circuits that we're creating and maintaining, and how that changes the circuits of the virus itself, and what can grow in a sense. And that's different being in the pandemic or looking to future pandemics. I think people are recognizing a certain need to switch the thinking, but I don't know whether that applies.
Yeah, thank you. This discussion also actually makes me want to think more about the consequences of these problematic representations. Earlier, we were also talking about the lack or absence of the federal government in the context of the United States. That's also part of my research, is trying to think about the state as a formation, a cultural formation, as in flux and not something that is stable and already there. And so of course, what comes to mind again is the whole fetishized China origin story. And perhaps this discussion would prompt us to thinking more about the consequence of that stabilization. Thank you.
I've been writing a lot about good microbes, and I teach a microbiome unit in one of my classes, and I found a lot of comfort in this piece, to come back to this piece again, and so I thank you. But I say comfort, especially in the middle of a lot of what is kind of cold comfort for me, because my husband is a surgeon and does the surgeries for lungs that have collapsed with COVID. So in Lombardia, and so we are divided now across continents, and but I found a lot of comfort, especially in this piece, and revisiting it, and especially thinking about this, the part where you talk about this as kind of like ancestral, and, you know, pushing back on what, Stefan, you were talking about before, about the disposition essentialism, the tendency towards disposition essentialism. So even as I've been talking amongst other friends and colleagues about, you know, we need to pinpoint the exact thing and sort of know, we need to know this in a certain way. And I actually have found the contrary in the midst of all this, that thinking of this as something ancestral, thinking of this as something, I think you mentioned that maybe placenta in this piece, and I recently wrote an article on placenta, and I thought that was like a really good, tangible example for me to think about what is the not only the past, the viral heritage, ancestry, but also moving forward. It is to think about it as something that continues and may even have some incredible potential down the line. I thought that example was really, I don't know, I just found it lovely and comforting in some strange way in a difficult moment. So I really just want to say thank you for that. And it's helping me think through a lot of different ways to push back on this kind of, as you called it, dispositional essentialism. So thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
I think it's I guess in terms of not knowing how things are going to interact in the future, I certainly think when we wrote it, we were never imagining it would be a source of comfort in a global pandemic. So it's that's very nice to hear.
I mean, I say cold comfort because you're looking for this, you're looking for that lack of, you're looking in some way to reestablish those boundaries as we've been discussing. But
Sure.
But I find it the potential of thinking processually and thinking in this way has been very insightful for me.
Yeah, that was Rachel, just picking up on some of what you're saying about the trajectory. I thought this information about retroviruses and when they're actually incorporated in the genome, and kind of these notions of self, other, and an other in terms of novelty. I mean, all of those were very interesting concepts of, like how much of the human genome has come from incorporation of new genes by viruses, and just this trajectory. And I also thought this, it was really complex, this virus taxonomy. That was like hard to understand and really interesting in terms of statements like, other than humans and pets, viruses are the only ones that each individual has a name kind of thing, has an identity, and how you identify novelty. And so like this idea that a virus that crosses a host barrier and acquires novel proteins remains part of the original species. I mean, that's pretty wild, to think of that. And I think of those concepts kind of like self-other and what's new in terms of biotechnology. When you're manipulating genomes, how much do you have to change before something becomes novel or new? Or what's the concept of hybrid? And I guess this kind of process thinking really speaks to multiple stages of hybridity in a sense. But yeah, Rachel, this kind of idea of trajectory, I think is really fascinating in terms of where that will lead.
Well, yeah, I agree with that. One thing that comes to mind for me here is going away from retroviruses to something like influenza, which is closer to corona as well. There were studies, and it goes slightly off now, but it has to do with the self and other, because there's a whole different dynamic in here. With influenza, it has been shown that its lipid envelope can incorporate some human proteins when it goes out of the cell infected. And so some people jump on that, saying the influenza virus is actually us to some degree. It's not as other as we would say. And that these are all anti-vaccination people. And, there's a whole, it's a different dimension of this process view that has troubled me at some points, that it's kind of, we tend to see it as something liberating or kind of opening up and even, comforting in a way, but it can also be twisted in a very different, into a different trajectory rhetorically. It can be brought into, well, we're fighting something that is us. There's a whole literature, like people use that on these health blogs and all that to talk about, don't vaccinate, you're killing parts of us because we need them and they're kind of friends and all that. So it goes off in weird ways. So it's I think there's a lot of responsibility. Undermining concepts like self and other comes at a cost, and so I think there's a burden on it ethically when you do that. So I I try to think about that to some degree. But yeah, it's a very interesting issue, I think.
Following up on Carolyn's question, I also found that part of.
Yes.
Oh wait,
Sorry.
are you asking a question, Roberta?
Yeah, but go first.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Sure.
No.
Okay.
I asked too many questions.
So moving from a more theoretical to a practical ground, do you have any practical recommendation from a process philosophy perspective on how to go through this pandemic in terms of behaviors, but also scientific approaches, so in general?
I mean, one thing, I mean, John has already highlighted that weirdly, when we talk about humans, it seems to be all processual in a strong way. Like we change our interactions and our patterns of movement and all that. So it's kind of really reshaping dynamics, the alignments of different processes and how they come together because they reinforce certain stabilities or hotspots or whatever. It's kind of a confluence of things. In the virus, in the realm of, I mean, this is again kind of dichotomy of the humans and the viruses, but in that realm, there is this trend of thinking about, well, I'm not sure it's a trend, but anyway, there are these people who think about messing with the processes that keep viral populations stable, and it's more about increasing mutagenesis and kind of this concept of lethal mutagenesis and kind of driving viruses to extinction. I mean, this is once they're in an organism, but yeah, so a process view fully support. I mean, it's not something new because it's something that virologists are already doing. They don't need us to realize that. But I mean, there's different narratives within virology, I assume. I don't have an exhaustive analysis of that, which would be interesting. But anyway, you know, a process view would certainly nudge a certain people into a certain way of thinking about it, which thinks about dealing with the system as a whole and creating a situation within which viruses don't find the stabilities that they can find if things are just anyway. So I think it's how we think about antivirals and immunity, how that is generated, and that obviously drags in gut microbes and all that. So I think that changes a lot.
And I'm not sure if this is really responsive to exactly the question you asked, but because one of the things that is so striking about this is how much of a mirror the virus provides for us to see things that we sometimes prefer not to see about our society. I mean, and that the way the virus discriminates against people of color, against working class versus, and of course the questions about age and disability and so on. So I mean, so partly that comes out of thinking about your response because, in a sense, one of the responses everybody recognizes is to try and divert the flow towards people who are less likely to be damaged by it, though we've sort of done exactly the opposite in the UK. I don't know how that exactly compares with with other countries, but so I mean, as I said, and this I guess leads to the question. One of the things that's so challenging and sort of threatening is how we see ourselves responding to it in a way that we know we get out of it having learnt things from it rather than having had it as an opportunity to make the things that are bad about our societies worse, which is certainly a risk. So that there's one aspect of the response is just to look, you know, how we understand the process and can make it, you know, do less damage to us in a purely medical way. But it's also the process is the interaction with this viral process is disrupting our society in very profound ways. And it's very important to see if we can figure out how to make those changes positive rather than negative. quite independently of the straightforwardly medical, things like killing us, which obviously are very preoccupying. But there are, we can kill ourselves. We can kill lots of ourselves quite different ways in the longer term by letting the virus leave bad consequences. And possibly in the long run, we can even turn it to being, a quite beneficial thing in many ways. Obviously, not in all ways.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
I have a few thoughts that I would like to link up there, but Eben, you had a comment earlier on, so my
Okay,
comment,
go ahead.
my question goes back to the discussion on the definition and unity. So whichever. So yeah, so just picking up on both of your comments earlier, you referred to the viral not being democratic. You talked about a certain high-risk groups. You mentioned different more than humans in there, and my question, my thought goes back to sort of what's included in the definition. What is you underline that we should think of viruses as in a processual way, and yet to avoid a kind of essentialism, and yet I feel like this is coming from a social science and anthropologist, so you can predict that it's surely the context and all the different actors, whether they are living or non-living or animals or humans, whatever, matters for what's involved in the process or in the context at any given point. So in a way, by not telling the story of a virus or of the virus ecology or the context, if you kind of reduce it to saying we have to look at it processually, but not tell what the process and other elements in the process are in any given case, isn't it in a way still an essentialism? Do you see what I'm saying? Like, so just to say it's processual but not tell about, say, the processes of the current pandemic, then we're not really describing it as with all the elements involved in that process, but just from the viral perspective. Does that make sense?
John, go ahead.
No, I've well, I mean, I guess just one thing. I mean, I'm not sure I quite understood what this danger of becoming essentialist is, because I mean, I guess the point of a process, I mean, 2 points about process is, one is that the way it is at one point can be quite different from the way it is at another point. No particular thing has to be constant at different stages of the process. And this actually, I think, relates to the virus species issue too, but that maybe. I mean, and then the other thing is that it's what look like essential properties are never intrinsic. They're never fully intrinsic. They're always relational to a particular context. And so I mean, you can't, in a sense, you can't change an essence, but you can change what a process does by changing the context it's in. So I mean, just I'm not sure if that's if I'm getting your worry.
I think there in the paper, I think it's a very good point and a fair point. I think in the paper, the one thing that is lacking is what John just alluded to at the end. We don't have a processual account of dispositions. I think that's a key issue that I think personally is in there. There's a you slip back into kind of its characteristic ways and all that. So that's one bit I think that is in that paper. A second bit is that it looked at a relatively limited body of literature, because 9,000 words and what you bring in and all that, and it's kind of in the microbiome literature, like there's you would allude to, well, diet matter, we have like one sentence like diet and virome composition are kind of linked. It's not a Lotka Volterra kind of up and down, or it's kind of alluded to quickly, but it's within that there would be so much more potential I agree that you have to include much more, and I think to understand why certain ways of doing things are so stabilized and look so essential quickly. Which then force us to talk in these kind of ways in the paper of this functional unity and all that, because it is kind of there. To understand that and develop a processual account of that, you will have to drag in much more. So that's part of what I want to do going forward, and kind of, but that gets so messy. And if you try to publish that in a philosophy journal, they'll rip you apart because there's no analysis, you're not analytic or anything. It's like, what is he talking about? And so it's, I mean, this stuff is, that this is a side issue. Where to publish these kind of things is a whole, you know, to get them seen. So that's why I just want to say thank you also that you chose the paper and that you read it, and thank you to Astrid as well, who I think is on here as well. Anyway, so yeah, I don't know whether that answers anything, but I agree.
I just wanted to pull back to a comment you made right before that about the concept of lethal mutagenesis, and then John, you talked about directing the flow. Are you guys going in the direction of gene drives for viruses or directed evolution type stuff?
This is something I've been quite involved with, because actually I've been involved with the Nuffield Council on Bioethics reports on gene drives. So it's something I've been thinking about quite a lot, which I guess may be an excuse for not answering your question, because I'm not sure exactly where to begin. But certainly, I mean, it's an interesting issue, which certainly looks. I mean, it's another area where a processual view is indispensable.
Could you do a gene drive for a virus on a large scale in a society?
So a gene drive, you mean what, for viral resistance, maybe? I mean,
yeah, I'm just pulling off the concept of gene drives in mosquitoes. So I mean, a different kind of thing, but I mean, very controversial concept of taking hold of the evolutionary trajectory in that way, but certainly a point at which society is at in terms of biotechnology.
I mean, we're very slow reproduce. I mean, I guess one of the things is timescales. I mean, the problem with viruses is that their timescale is very fast by our standards, and human reproduction is very slow. So, you know, ways of so a lot of gene drive technologies would be inconceivably, I mean, and very ineffectively slow in relation to this kind of issue. I mean, there could be other ways of maybe spreading some kind of genetic modification other than through reproduction, but it's getting pretty scary stuff, I think. I think the ethical concerns of kind of spreading a genetic modification through some environmental mode of, I guess, you know, maybe have some mosquito with a you know, kind of injecting us with a virus with some CRISPR-Cas kind of I don't know, it'd be pretty scary, I think.
I think I was thinking more of like modifying the viruses.
Insert myself as moderator and host, because of, in part I want to ask my pressing question and we're running out of time, and then also in part because I've just written a book about CRISPR, and you know, we're not going to see the release of a gene drive because, you know, in a clinical setting there are gene therapies that are being brought into market. They're very expensive. They're being rolled out in contexts of highly capitalized spaces. I doubt we're going to see on a population level, you know, the introduction of one of these retroviruses to kind of spread what are perceived as beneficial genes.
So I can make a very good point. I guess I misheard the question, but I guess I don't think you can gene drive a virus because it's the technology. I mean, it's an antiviral. It's an antiviral technology you're picking up from bacteria to do it, and I'm not sure that it would make sense to think of doing it to the virus. But that's
so one of the things I really loved about the paper is this idea of the virome, you know, alongside the proteome and the microbiome. We can think about the specificity of this library, as you describe it, of you know, additional genetic resources. And this figure of 8% of the human genome consisting of ERVs is staggering in the context of us being 98% chimpanzee. You know, like we've got a lot of virus in us. And you gave the example of the seaweed, that apparently some functional genes that let people in Japan better digest seaweed have been one function of these ERVs. And I guess my question is, like, first of all, how much do we know about that 8% of the genome, which again seems huge? And based on what we know, are most of these novel or additional genetic resources beneficial in some way, or function unknown, or non-functional?
There is a so I worked on a grant application which has been graciously rejected with some virologist friends of mine, where we wanted to look at the concepts of collaboration between viruses and human, and the ERVs were part of that. And there's a fascinating literature emerging more and more. I think the picture is most of them do nothing anymore. They're so ancient and all that, but there are some that are in the process of becoming endogenous. Do I remember? I would have to refresh it. I don't remember all of it anymore, unfortunately. But yeah, no, they are discovering. Oh no, it also has to do with there's all kind of mobile elements. So it's not just ERVs, but obviously there's a whole class of mobile genetic elements, and kind of they're discovering so many more functions for lines, signs, all these kind of long interspersed. Anyway, and what do you want to say? One thing that struck me about that is again, whether they work or not has a lot to do with an alignment with other processes. So in some organisms, Drosophila, for instance, there's a mechanism within the germline, because the organism has to adjust somehow to that fluid environment. In the germline, there's certain mechanisms that suppress the activity of mobile elements, because obviously too much activity would be detrimental, because it would be passed on and all that. Whereas in other contexts, there's more playing room. So this 8%, I think, again, it's a highly contextual thing. Where are we looking at? How are we looking at it? Yeah, sorry.
And I guess, I mean, just to add to that, I mean, we should be very careful not to fetishize the germline. I think, because I mean the Japanese seaweed example, I don't think that's not an ERV. That's just something that's become part of the bacterial microbiome, and it's fine there. I mean, you can it can stay there and still do what it does for us. So there's once one is thinking in terms of something like the holobiont, then there are lots of ways of picking up functions from other organisms in the environment that don't require it gets written into your germline. And of course, it's also possible that some things maybe someday it will get written in. I mean, there are all these mobile genetic elements that can pick something up and move it around, and maybe, but there's no particular reason why that would happen, I think, or why it would matter whether it happened to us. So in a sense, I think the ERVs are kind of the tip of an iceberg of ways in which we pick up functionality from other organisms, if I can, in the environment, or other elements of the environment.
I've got one question that came in over email from David Turnbull in Australia, who it's basically after midnight in Australia, so he had good intentions of staying up to try to join us, but ultimately go to sleep. So I'm going to try to recreate his question. It's not written in a very long sense, but hopefully there's references in there that you can just kind of riff on. I would have liked to have asked what you all think about Haraway and Dempster's suggestion that autopoiesis, i.e. sympoiesis rather than symbiogenesis.
Sorry, I don't know.
Should I read it again? I mean, it's kind of, let me try again. I think also the connection.
My signal is going, so I actually couldn't hear.
Maybe copy and paste it into the chat box.
Yeah, that's a great idea, Ken. So I'm going to try to read it again and also paste it. Okay, so pasting in the chat. So I would have liked to have asked what you think about Haraway and Dempster's suggestion that autopoietic systems need to be open and emergent, that is, sympoiesis rather than symbiogenesis.
It's yeah, I can maybe say, I mean, I did Beth Dempster, or as she wrote her thesis on self-organizing systems, and she said autopoiesis is kind of a flawed concept, and it should be sympoiesis. And I think Donna Haraway has picked up on it a lot, so she uses sympoiesis as well, or however it's pronounced. But I mean, symbiotic systems, I mean, I don't have a strong view. I think it's closely related to what we're talking about, just without dipping into the process substance technical debate within philosophy. So she talks about, symbiotic systems do not have self-defined spatial or temporal boundaries. So whatever boundary you find is always co-created by within an open system. Or so I don't know the details exactly. I just always felt there's a close affinity between what she views and how we would approach things. But I don't think we build on the same. It's again the limitations of academic writing and what you're reading, and kind of, I guess we're trying to say the same thing with different literatures and examples. Maybe, I'm not sure.
Certainly, I think that the idea that the autopoiesis has, I mean, that things don't make themselves, is a problem with the term. How deep a problem it is with how people use the term and what they actually say using it is obviously a lot more complicated. But I certainly would agree that the term is problematic.
Yeah, and maybe I think lingering in that question, for me, symbiogenesis a la Margulis is about the creation or the emergence of kinds, which is obviously something you've written a lot on, John. I don't feel like I really have my head around what sympoiesis, like the potentialities or the specificity of what that means, but yeah, I mean, it seems like focusing on a process ontology instead of like a classificatory project. And maybe, John, this is maybe a broader question about your work. Like, how do you, relate your earlier work on promiscuous realism and species and kinds to this processual ontology thinking? Are you still interested and excited about kinds, and are processes more interesting to you now, or are you holding the two together?
I think, I'm interested in both, and in an interesting way, I think what one finds out. I mean, I tend to sometimes think, to be rather distressed at how unified what I think turns out to be in my mind, but I guess what I would say in a very simple story about the relationship between my sort of earlier work on disunity, promiscuous realism, and that stuff, and my the process view is that I tended to think, back 25 years ago, whatever, that the promiscuous realism, the lack of there being any privileged set of kinds that we should divide the world up in, was sort of just a brute fact. It just turned out that way. We looked at the sort of scientific work on particularly in biology, and it turned out that was just how things were. Everything was diverse and cross-cut, and any classifications were cross-cutting. And I guess what I think now is that this is not an accident at all. It just reflects the fact that we are constantly cutting these kind of atemporal snapshots through processes, and we're doing it, and there's no one way to do that. There's no one path through a bunch of these processes that is privileged. So it's in a sense the anti-essentialism, the promiscuous realism is just inevitable in a process world. So I guess I now move the brute fact back to our living in a world that's all process, which I guess we might have lived in a world which was atomic and full of kind of machines with essential properties and so on, but we don't live in anything like that. And in a world that's the way ours is, that this whole kind of traditional picture of essences and kinds just doesn't get any grip. It doesn't have anything. It just doesn't make any sense. So that's a very short story of how I tie my intellectual life into a kind of fortune cookie.
Well, thank you both for this delightful paper. I also found it deeply comforting in times of pandemic and incredibly enlightening just about life itself. And also really want to thank Sala for saving the day today, and for everyone being fleet-footed as we switched around possible Zoom processes and ontologies. And Sala, I might actually put you on the spot and say that I know you're working on a lot of really interesting, basically I don't have readings set up for next week. So would you be interested and willing to share either something you've already published or something in process that relates to these matters? And I think you're muted right now. You're muted.
I thought I muted, but it looks like I unmuted. Leave that with me. Or
Okay.
possibly suggesting something that we have been thinking with in my group. That could be also an option.
Cool. Well,
yeah.
maybe we can have a private chat right now. And everyone, I was thinking of an hour slot that's like maybe 3 hours ahead. So Rachel, I know that I think you woke up at 6 today to be with us, and I was trying to use this time slot as a compromise between the West Coast and Australia. And since I don't see any Australians on this call, let's make it friendlier to the West Coast, still in a European zone that works. So I think that would be 5 o'clock London time, 12 noon in New York, and then 9 a.m. on the West Coast of the US. So next Sunday, we'll eventually switch back to a time slot that also is friendly to Australia, but so we've also got the possibility of Mel Chen next week. Mel has offered their paper on masks, which is incredibly timely right now. So between Sala and Mel, we'll have some good readings for next week.
And
All
just
right, thanks everybody.
Thank you
Again.
for
Go ahead, John.
Thank you for inviting us, and for reading our paper. It was very enjoyable.
It was delightful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.